She begged to trade her baby for bread, but the rancher said nothing, then took both. The morning came with no softness. The sun rose like a hammer striking the earth, its light blinding, merciless. The woman woke to the sound of roosters in the yard, the creak of leather, and the muted thud of boots on wooden floors. She stirred, clutching her child tighter, her heart leaping with the fear that perhaps it had all been a dream, the bread, the bed, the silent rancher. But when she opened her eyes, reality met her like a wall. She was still in the rancher's house. The child slept against her chest, warm and breathing. And by the door, the rancher stood, fastening his coat, ready to step into the endless labor of the day. She sat up, voice trembling. "Please, I will work. Don't send me away." The words spilled before she could contain them, before shame could stop them. Pride had been stripped from her, burned away by hunger. She was no longer a woman who could demand, only one who could plead. She feared that he might feed them once, perhaps twice, then cast them back into the dust. The rancher paused. He turned his head, his gaze resting on her for a breath that felt eternal. His eyes carried the weight of storms, the weight of solitude that had been lived too long. And then, without a word, he stepped outside. The door closed softly behind him. She sat frozen, her plea hanging unanswered, her mind racing with dread. Yet when she rose and walked to the kitchen, she found bread left on the table, a pitcher of water beside it, and a folded cloth that smelled faintly of soap. He had not spoken, he had not promised, but his silence had prepared for her. It was enough. She tore small pieces of bread and pressed them to the child's lips. He ate greedily, eyes fluttering shut in contentment. She wept again, though no one heard. Her tears were not only sorrow but release, for the weight she had carried alone was now shared, even if she did not yet understand how. The hours crawled by. She cleaned the small space, her hands trembling as she scrubbed dishes, swept floors, straightened blankets. Each act was both gratitude and fear, as though by labor she could earn the right to remain. The child slept more peacefully than he had in weeks, his small chest rising and falling with a rhythm that stilled the storm inside her. By midday, the rancher returned. His boots were coated with dust, his shirt clung to him with sweat, and the scent of earth and cattle followed him like a cloak. He said nothing as he entered, only washed his hands, sat at the table, and cut bread. He slid a portion toward her without looking. She hesitated, but hunger pushed her forward. She sat across from him, the baby between them, and ate in silence. For long minutes, there was only the sound of bread tearing, water pouring, the baby's faint coos. She stole glances at him, searching for answers in the creases of his face. Who was this man who spoke nothing, yet gave enough? Why had he taken them both when the world had already decided they were worthless? She wanted to ask, but the words died before they reached her lips. His silence was not emptiness. It was weight. It was law. When the meal was done, he rose again. This time, he left tools near the door, a small basket, a rag, a broom. He said nothing, but his intent was clear. She had asked to work. He had given her work. She cleaned, gathered, tended. The rhythm of labor steadied her, gave her something more than hunger to think about. With every task, she felt her hands reclaim strength, her body remember life beyond despair. She found herself humming once, a broken melody, until shame silenced it. Music felt too bright for someone who had begged to sell her child for bread. Days passed, marked not by words but by silence filled with meaning. Each morning, bread and water. Each day, work and labor. Each night, food upon the table, enough to keep breath in their lungs and hope stirring faintly. The child grew stronger, his cheeks filling, his eyes brightening. He laughed once, a small, fragile sound, and it startled her so much that she wept into her hands. The rancher had been mending tools at the table. He did not look up, but she saw the corner of his mouth twitch, the barest ghost of something almost like a smile. That single flicker sustained her more than bread. Yet beneath the fragile peace lay tension, like cracks under stone. The townsfolk noticed. Word spread quickly in small places. The rancher, silent and solitary, had brought strangers into his home, a woman and her child, broken, nameless. Whispers stirred in the saloon, in the church, at the trading post. Men muttered that no good would come of it. Women hissed that shame lived under his roof. Children pointed when she passed by, clutching her child, shoulders hunched beneath invisible weight. She heard it all, she bore it all, but she could not leave. Not now, not when bread was life, and life was all that mattered. One afternoon, she ventured into town alone for flour. The child clung to her, small fingers tangled in her hair. The streets narrowed around her as whispers sharpened into words meant for her ears. That's her, the beggar who offered her baby. Living off the rancher now, isn't she? Disgrace. A woman like that ought to be gone by now. She kept her eyes low, her steps quick. She did not defend herself. She did not cry. She had cried enough tears to drown a desert, and still the world had not softened. She bought the flour with the rancher's coins and hurried back, her heart pounding with shame. She thought of running, taking her child, fleeing into the wilds, but where could she go? Hunger would find them again. Only silence had saved them. That night, the rancher found her trembling by the hearth, the child asleep against her chest. She could not hide the tears that streaked her face. He set his hat upon the table, stood before her, and for the first time, his silence cracked. His voice was low, deep, rough from disuse, yet it carried like thunder. Eat, live, stay. 3 words, nothing more, yet they struck her harder than all the cruelty of the town. He did not care for whispers. He did not bend to shame. His words were not kindness, they were command. And in them, she heard the promise she had been starving for. You are not alone. She bowed her head, clutching her child closer. The tears that fell now were not only grief, but the first fragile seed of hope. The rancher returned to his silence. But she no longer feared it. The days turned into weeks, and though her body grew stronger, the woman never shook the sound of whispers clinging to her back. Whenever she stepped into town for flour, salt, or cloth, she felt eyes burn through her as though she were guilty of a crime too shameful to name. She heard it in fragments: beggar, shame, sin, unfit. Yet when she returned to the ranch, the silence swallowed those voices whole. The house stood unshaken, the rancher unmoved, his wordless presence stronger than all their scorn. Her child thrived. His laughter grew louder, his small steps began to echo through the wooden halls. She would lift him high, and his giggles would fill the silence the rancher had long lived in. At times she caught him watching from the doorway, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. But she noticed how his eyes softened when the boy laughed, how his silence held warmth it had never known before. One evening, after supper, the boy toddled across the room, his small legs wobbly, his arms outstretched. He stumbled, and before she could rise, the rancher moved. His hands, rough, scarred, built for reins and rope, caught the child with a gentleness that startled her. The boy clung to his shirt, laughing at his own fall. The rancher steadied him, then set him back on his feet, his face unreadable but his hands unshaken. She saw then what she had not dared hope, that his silence was not empty but waiting, holding something deeper than words could reach. Yet peace is never left alone. It was late autumn when the storm broke. The sheriff came first, riding hard, dust rising behind his horse. He dismounted with the weight of a man carrying news, not choice. She stood on the porch, the child pressed to her hip, while the rancher stepped forward, broad and silent as stone. "There's talk," the sheriff began, hat in hand. "About the woman you've taken in. Folks are restless. Say it ain't right. Say she's tainted. Say you've gone soft." His eyes flicked to her, then back to the rancher. "I don't care what a man does in his own house. But unrest spreads quick, and if unrest spreads, law follows." The rancher said nothing. His silence was a wall. The sheriff shifted, uneasy. "You hear me?" The rancher's eyes burned into him, and for a moment, the air grew heavy. Then, with the same voice that had spoken only once before, he rumbled, "She stays." Just 2 words, but they struck with the weight of a hammer. The sheriff gave a slow nod, as though he had expected nothing else. He tipped his hat, mounted, and rode back. But the woman's heart trembled. She knew whispers had teeth. And she feared they would bite. That night she could not sleep. The child dozed peacefully, but her thoughts churned. She remembered the village she had fled, the hunger that had torn families apart, the hollow eyes of neighbors who had turned her away. She had thought she had escaped judgment, but judgment had followed her, wearing new faces. She turned toward the rancher's shadow at the window, his silence unbroken. She wanted to speak her fear, but she could not. Words seemed too small against his silence. Winter crept in, cold and sharp. Snow dusted the ranch, cattle grew restless, wood burned quick in the hearth. The woman worked beside him, mending clothes, cooking meals, feeding livestock when his hands were too full. Their lives entwined without declaration, woven together in silence and survival. The child grew stronger, his laughter the only melody in a house that had long known only wind. But the town's unrest thickened. Men muttered in saloons that the rancher had been bewitched. Women whispered in markets that the child was cursed. By Christmas, the talk grew into something sharper, a call for action. They said no woman who had offered her baby for bread could be trusted. They said the rancher's silence hid shame too heavy to name. One bitter night, the truth came pounding at their door. The sound split the silence like thunder. Fists, voices. The rancher rose, his body rigid, his hand brushing against the rifle resting near the hearth. She clutched the child close, heart racing. The door rattled under the force of fists. "Come out, rancher," a voice bellowed. "Bring her out. Let the town judge what you're hiding." The rancher opened the door. Snow whipped inside, carrying the bitter faces of men with lanterns and anger. They stood in a half circle, breath steaming, eyes hard. The sheriff was not among them. This was not law. This was mob. "She's filth," one spat, pointing at the woman. "Trading her baby for bread. Shame like that don't belong on this land." Another growled. "And you, keeping her here, feeding her, raising that child, what kind of man are you?" The rancher's silence held. He did not raise his rifle, though his hand rested on it. He did not step aside, though the men pressed forward. He simply stood, his frame filling the doorway, his eyes burning with an authority deeper than law. The woman trembled, clutching the child, fear clawing her chest. She expected him to cast her out, to surrender her to their judgment. He owed her nothing, but instead, he spoke. "She stays." 3 words, nothing more, but they cracked like thunder. The men growled, restless. "Why?" one demanded. "Why risk your name, your land, for her?" The rancher's jaw tightened. His silence stretched until even the wind seemed to pause. Then, with a voice that rumbled from the marrow of the earth, he answered. "Because no one else did." The words struck like fire in dry grass. The men faltered, caught off guard by the weight of truth. His eyes burned through them, steady, unyielding. "When the world left her to die, I did not. When hunger took her name, I gave her bread. When you whispered shame, I gave her silence. And still, she stays." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, one by one, the men turned away, their anger cracked by something they could not fight. The snow swallowed their retreat, their lanterns shrinking into darkness. The rancher closed the door, the silence heavier than ever. The woman fell to her knees, tears spilling, clutching her child. "Why?" she whispered. "Why protect me? Why bear their anger for me?" The rancher looked at her, his face carved with years of storms, his eyes shadowed with solitude. His silence held, but when he spoke, his voice broke something inside her. "Because once, I begged too. And no one came." The truth spilled in fragments across the weeks that followed. A wife lost to fever. A child buried too young. A man left in silence because grief had stolen every word. He had built his ranch in solitude, walled himself in silence, because the world had shown him no mercy. Until she came. Until her desperation mirrored his own. In her hunger, he had seen his own grief. In her plea, he had heard his own unspoken cries. And in her child's laughter, he had felt a spark of life that silence had long buried. Spring came, melting snow into streams, coaxing green from the earth. The whispers in town quieted. No one dared challenge the rancher again, for his silence had proven stronger than their noise. The woman tended the ranch as though it were her own. The child grew into the land, his laughter echoing in fields once empty. And the rancher, though still a man of silence, found words in moments when silence was not enough. Words not of pity, but of strength. Eat, live, stay. Each word a command, each word a promise, each word binding them tighter into a family not born of blood, but of silence, bread, and mercy. And so, The woman who once begged to trade her baby for bread found that both she and her child had been taken not to be discarded, but to be restored. Taken into a silence deeper than shame, a silence that did not judge, a silence that built life from ruin. The rancher said little, but his actions spoke louder than any sermon, louder than any law. And in his silence, they were no longer alone. Thank you so much for watching this story till the very end. Your support means more than words can ever say. If you felt the depth of this journey, don't forget to give it a like, share it with someone who needs it, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll keep bringing powerful stories to life, and your presence here makes all the difference.